Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are continuing on with The Man Who Laughs by Victor Hugo, starting with Part 2, Book the Fourth, Chapter 6. But first, reading updates. I I don't know where to begin. I guess we'll start with the one that I finished. So I started and finished this book today. It's a graphic novel. Don't be too impressed. Um, it's called, I posted it on my Instagram, so if you saw it, this is no shock to you, but it's called Goodbye Eri, and it's by Tatsuki Fujimoto, who is also the creator of Chainsaw Man. Um, I read it, and I don't know what happens. I have so many questions. I have so like I finished the book. First of all, I got chills at several points. I read it in public at a cafe with my Americano, and I got so many chills at very specific points in the story. And when I finished, it was just like, what did I just read? What did what? It's so good. It's so good. And I feel like now that I have read it all and I like know what happens, I think I'm going to read it again with a different eye to see like if I can like analyze more or pick things out that I missed the first time. It's like when you watch The Sixth Sense the first time and you're like, "Oh," and then you rewatch it and it still holds up. Um or Knives Out if you want something more current. A more current example. So I just really liked it. I really liked it. The art is super good. But yeah, it's about this kid whose mom is dying at the beginning, and she asks him to film her last days, like right up until the very last breath. Um, and he does. Like she gives him a smartphone, and so he's filming through that, and you question what actually happened and what didn't happen constantly, which is really cool. And then the other book I started on Monday, which is it's an advanced copy book, which I talked about this before, I think, but it is Womb City. It doesn't come out until January, and I don't really know what's going on. It's in the future, and it's in a future where people can have their consciousness hopped into other bodies. And this, like, our main character, at least so far, I'm only like 8% of the way in, but at least so far, she is trying to have a baby with her partner, and it's just not working out. And they go to a facility where they grow babies in pods. And if you miss monthly payments, then they either like pull the plug or they take the baby, let it grow up, and then it will become a body for other consciences to hop into. That's all that I know so far. Wild. Wild. But today we are hopping back into The Man Who Laughs. Okay, let's see if we can remember what happened last time. It was, oh, the Duchess was there. The Duchess showed up to the show at the Tadcaster Inn and was super intrigued, everything like that. We found out that Tom Jim Jack actually knows the Duchess, and Gwynplaine, who's our main person, did like a no. Gwynplaine, who is our main person, started having dreams about her. Even though he like still super loves Dea, like all of that sort of thing. And he's like warring back and forth with that idea. And he gets a note because he takes walks at night when nobody's around just to sort of clear his head. And he gets a note slid into his hand from the squire, footman, servant, I don't really know, of the Duchess. And it basically, it's like insulting him, but also like praising him. It's very weird. It's like, I'm beautiful and you're hideous. I'm wealthy and you're poor. I love you. Meet me at this place. And so then he's sort of trying to war with himself the idea of if he's going to go there or if he's not. And as he's like thinking over all of these things, he like burns the letter. He goes to sleep. He wakes up. Daya's there. Well, he doesn't really go to sleep. It's a sleepless sleep. But he wakes up, Daya's there, they go down to breakfast, and then the like police person who we've talked about before, um, comes, taps him on the shoulder with his like scepter or staff or whatever it is, and signifies that Gwynplaine needs to follow him. So they don't tell Taya what is going on because they don't want her to worry, anything like that, especially if it's going to be something super, super small where they just have to go to court and then, like, Gwynplaine will be back. So Ursus follows, and there comes a point in the walk where Ursus knows, like, okay, if they go left, they're going to the court. It'll be super fast. Gwynplaine will be back for that night's performance. If they go right, bad things. And of course they go right. Of course they do. And we left off with them, with the like group of people and Gwynplaine walking into the jail. There was like a bunch of history about the jail and how it became the jail and what it was before and all of those things, because of course there was, because Victor Hugo loves to throw extra context and extra history at us. But that's where we left off. So, so with that, let's do it. I say let's do it like I'm fully prepared, but I'm not. Oh, I am prepared. Okay, cool. Let's do it. Chapter 6. The kind of magistracy under the wigs of former days. Anyone observing at that moment the other side of the prison, its facade, would have perceived the high street of Southwark, and might have remarked, stationed before the monumental and official entrance to the jail, a travelling carriage, recognized as such by its imperial. A few idlers surrounded the carriage. On it was a coat of arms, and a personage had been seen to descend from it and enter the prison. Probably a magistrate, conjectured the crowd. Many of the English magistrates were noble, and almost all had the right of bearing arms. In France, blazon and robe were almost contradictory terms. The Duke St. Simon says, in speaking of magistrates, people of that class. In England, a gentleman was not despised for being a judge. They are travelling magistrates in England. They are called judges of circuit, and nothing was easier than to recognize the carriage as the vehicle of a judge on circuit. That which was less comprehensible that that the supposed magistrate got down, not from the carriage itself, but from the box, a place which is not habitually occupied by the owner. Another unusual thing, people traveled at that period in England in two ways: by coach, at the rate of a shilling for 5 miles, and by post, paying 3 halfpence per mile, and 2 pence to the postilion after each stage. A private carriage, whose owner desired to travel by relays, paid as much shillings per horse per mile as the horseman paid per pence. The carriage drawn up before the jail in Southwark had 4 horses and 2 postilions, which displayed princely state. Finally, that which excited and disconcerted conjectures to the utmost was the circumstance that the carriage was sedulously shut up. The blinds of the windows were closed up. The glasses in front were darkened by blinds. Every opening by which the eye might have penetrated was masked. From without, nothing within could be seen, and most likely from within, nothing could be seen outside. However, it did not seem probable that there was any one in the carriage. Southwark being in Surrey, the prison was within the jurisdiction of the sheriff of the county. Such distinct jurisdictions were very frequent in England. Thus, for example, the Tower of London was not supposed to be situated in any county. That is to say, that legally it was considered to be in air. The Tower recognized no authority of jurisdiction except in its own constable, who was qualified as custos turris. The Tower had its jurisdiction, its church, its court of justice, and its government apart. The authority of its custos, or constable, extended beyond London over 21 hamlets. As in Great Britain, legal singularities engraft one upon another, the office of the Master Gunner of England was derived from the Tower of London. Other legal customs seem still more whimsical. Thus, the English Court of Admiralty consults and applies the laws of Rhodes and of Oleron, a French island which was once English. The sheriff of a county was a person of high consideration. He was always an esquire and sometimes a knight. He was called spectabilis in the old deeds, a man to be looked at, kind of intermediate title between illustrious and clarismus, less than the first, more than the second. Long ago the sheriffs of the counties were chosen by the people, but Edward II, and after him Henry VI, having claimed their nomination for the crown, the office of sheriff became a royal emanation. They all received their commissions from Majesty, except the sheriff of Westmoreland, whose office was hereditary, and the sheriffs of London and Middlesex, who were elected by the livery in the Common Hall. Sheriffs of Wales and Chester possessed certain fiscal prerogatives. These appointments are all still in existence in England, but, subjected little by little to the friction of manners and ideas, they have lost their old aspects. It was the duty of the sheriff of the county to escort and protect the judges on the circuit. As we have 2 arms, he had 2 officers. His right arm, the under-sheriff, his left arm, the justice of the quorum. The justice of the quorum, assisted by the bailiff of the 100, termed the wapentake, apprehended, examined, and, under the responsibility of the sheriff, imprisoned. For trial by the judges of circuit, thieves, murderers, rebels, vagabonds, and all sorts of felons. The shade of difference between the under-sheriff and the justice of quorum in their hierarchical service towards the sheriff was that the under-sheriff, accompanied by the justice of the quorum, assisted. The sheriff held 2 courts, one fixed and central, the county court, and a movable court, the sheriff's turn. He thus represented both unity and ubiquity. He might as judge be aided and informed on legal questions by the sergeant of the coif, called surgeons coiffés, who is a sergeant at law, and who wears under his black skull cap a fillet of white cambray lawn. The sheriff delivered the jails. When he arrived at a town in his province, he had the right of summary trial of the prisoners, of which he might cause either their release or their execution. This was called a jail delivery. The sheriff presented bills of indictment to the 24 members of the grand jury. If they approved, they wrote above billa vera. If the contrary, they wrote ignoramus. In the latter case, the accusation was annulled, and the sheriff had the privilege of tearing up the bill. If during the deliberation a juror died, this legally acquitted the prisoner and made him innocent, and the sheriff, who had the privilege of arresting the accused, had also that of setting him at liberty. That which made the sheriff singularly feared and respected was that he had the charge of executing all the orders of Her Majesty. A fearful latitude. An arbitrary power lodges in such commissions. The officers termed vergers, the coroners making part of the sheriff's cortege, and the clerks of the market as escort, with gentlemen on horseback and their servants in livery, made a handsome suite. The sheriff, says Chamberlain, is the life of justice, of law, and of the country. In England, an insensible demolition constantly pulverizes and dissevers laws and customs. You must understand in our day that neither the sheriff, the wapentake, nor the justice of the quorum could exercise their functions as they did then. There was in the England of the past a certain confusion of powers, whose ill-defined attributes resulted in their overstepping their real bounds at times, a thing which would be impossible in the present day. The usurpation of power by police and justices has ceased. We believe that even the word wapentake has changed its meaning. It implied a magisterial function. Now it signifies a territorial division. It specified the centurion. It now specifies the 100 centum. Moreover, in those days the sheriff of the county combined with something more and something less, and condensed in his own authority, which was at once royal and municipal, the two magistrates formerly called in France the civil lieutenant of Paris and the lieutenant of police. The civil lieutenant of Paris, Monsieur, is pretty well described in an old police note. The civil lieutenant has no dislike to domestic quarrels because he always has the pickings. 22nd July, 1704. As to the lieutenant of police, he was a redoubtable person, multiple and vague. The best personification of him was René d'Argenson, who, as was said by Saint Simon, displayed in his face the three judges of hell united. The three judges of hell sat, as has already been seen, at Bishopsgate, London. End of chapter 6. Okay, so chapter 6 is basically like, okay, we have this quorum. What makes up the quorum? What they do? And so we go through some, I don't know if all of them, but some of the people, the notables in the quorum and their, like, history. Because of course we're going through their history. Chapter 7. Shuddering. When Gwynplaine heard the wicket shut, creaking in all its bolts, he trembled. It seemed to him that the door which had just closed was the communication between light and darkness, opening on one side of the living human crowd, and on the other on a dead world. And now that everything illuminated by the sun was behind him, that he had stepped over the boundary of life and was standing without it, his heart contracted. What were they going to do with him? What did it all mean? Where was he? He saw nothing around him. He found himself in perfect darkness. The shutting of the door had momentarily blinded him. The window in the door had been closed as well. No loophole, no lamp. Such were the precautions of old times. It was forbidden to light the entrance to the jails, so that the newcomer should take no observations. Gwynplaine extended his arms, and touched the wall on the right side and on the left. He was in a passage, little by little a cavernous daylight exuding, no one knows whence, and which floats about dark places, and to which the dilation of the pupil adjusts itself slowly, enabled him to distinguish a feature here and there, and the corridor was vaguely sketched out before him. Gwynplaine, who had never had a glimpse of penal severities, save in the exaggerations of Ursus, felt as though seized by a sort of vague, gigantic hand. To be caught in the mysterious toils of the law is frightful. He who is brave in the other dangers is disconcerted in the presence of justice. Why? Is it that the justice of man works in twilight, and the judge gropes his way? Gwynplaine remembered what Ursus had told him of the necessity for silence. He wished to see Dea again. He felt some discretionary instinct which urged him not to irritate. Sometimes to wish to be enlightened is to make matters worse. On the other hand, however, the weight of the adventure was so overwhelming that he gave way at length and could not restrain a question. "Gentlemen," he said, "whither you are taking me?" They made no answer. It was the law of silent capture, and the Norman text is formal. This silence froze Gwynplaine. Up to that moment he had believed himself to be firm. He was self-sufficing. To be self-sufficing is to be powerful. He had lived isolated from the world, and imagined that being alone he was unassailable, and now, all at once, he felt himself under the pressure of a hideous collective force. How was he to combat that horrible anonyma, the law? He felt faint under the perplexity. A fear of an unknown character had found a fissure in his armor. Besides, he had not slept. He had not eaten. He had scarcely moistened his lips with a cup of tea. The whole night had been passed in a kind of delirium, and the fever was still on him. He was thirsty, perhaps hungry. The craving of the stomach disorders everything. Since the previous evening all kinds of incidents had assailed him. The emotions which had tormented had sustained him. Without the storm, a sail would be a rag. But this was the excessive feebleness of the rag, which the wind inflates till it tears it. He felt himself sinking. Was he about to fall without consciousness on the pavement? To faint is the resource of a woman and the humiliation of a man. He hardened himself, but he trembled. He felt as one losing his footing. End of chapter 7. Okay, so chapter 7, they're inside, and you can't really see anything. And so he's like feeling around, and he feels that he's like maybe in a hall of some sort. And he remembers that Ursa said, "Don't talk unless somebody directly asks you a question." And he needs to know. So he just asks. He's like, "So, like, where are we going?" And nobody answers. Everybody is so quiet. And at that point, Gwynplaine is like, "I thought that I was somebody who is very strong and somebody who could just withstand everything and somebody who is so self-sufficient and everything like that." But at that moment, he realizes he might not be as strong as what he thought, which is kind of cool. Chapter 8. Lamentation. It's a big chapter. Get cozy. They began to move forward. They advanced through the passage. There was no preliminary registry, no place of record. The prisons in those times were not overburdened with documents. They were content to close round you without knowing why. To be a prison and to hold prisoners sufficed. The procession was obliged to lengthen itself out, taking the form of the corridor. They walked almost in single file. First the wapentake, then Gwynplaine, then the judge of the quorum, then the constables, advancing in a group and blocking up the passage behind Gwynplaine as with a bung. The passage narrowed. Now Gwynplaine touched the walls with both his elbows. In the roof, which was made of flints, Dashed with cement was a succession of granite arches jutting out, and still more contracting the passage. He had to stoop to pass under them. No speed was possible in that corridor. Anyone trying to escape through it would have been compelled to move slowly. The passage twisted. All entrails are tortuous, those of a prison as well as those of a man. Here and there, sometimes to the right and sometimes to the left, spaces in the wall, square and closed by large iron gratings, gave glimpses of flights of stairs, some descending and some ascending. They reached a closed door. It opened. They passed through and it closed again. Then they came to a second door, which admitted them, then to a third, which also turned on its hinges. These doors seemed to open and shut of themselves. No one was to be seen. While the corridor contracted, the roof grew lower, until at length it was impossible to stand upright. Moisture exuded from the walls. Drops of water fell from the vault. The slabs that paved the corridor were clammy as an intestine. Gross. The diffused pallor that served as light became more and more a pall. Air was deficient, and, what was singularly ominous, the passage was a descent. Close observation was necessary to perceive that there was such a descent. In darkness, a gentle declivity is portentous. Nothing is more fearful than the vague evils to which we are led by imperceptible degrees. It is awful to descend into unknown depths. How long had they proceeded thus? Gwynplaine could not tell. Moments passed under such crushing agony seem immeasurably prolonged. Suddenly, they halted. The darkness was intense. The corridor widened somewhat. Gwynplaine heard close to him a noise of which only a Chinese gong could give an idea. Something like a blow struck against the diaphragm of the abyss. It was the wapentake, striking his wand against a sheet of iron. That sheet of iron was a door. Not a door on hinges, but a door which was raised and let down. Something like a portcullis. There was a sound of creaking in a groove, and Gwynplaine was suddenly face to face with a bit of square light. The sheet of metal had just been raised into a slit in the vault, like the door of a mousetrap. An opening had appeared. The light was not daylight, but glimmer. But on the dilated eyeballs of Gwynplaine the pale and sudden ray struck like a flash of lightning. It was some time before he could see anything. To see which dazzled eyes is as difficult as to see in darkness. At length, by degrees, the pupil of his eye became proportioned to the light, just as it had been proportioned to the darkness, and he was able to distinguish objects. The light, which at first had seemed too bright, settled into its proper hue and became livid. He cast a glance into the yawning space before him, and what he saw was terrible. At his feet were about 20 steps, steep, narrow, worn, almost perpendicular, without balustrade on either side, a sort of stone ridge cut out from the side of a wall into stairs, entering and leading into a very deep cell. They reached to the bottom. The cell was round, roofed by an ogee vault with a low arch from the fault of level in the top stone of the frieze, a displacement common to cells under heavy edifices. The kind of hole, acting as a door, which the sheet of iron had just revealed, and on which the stairs abutted, was formed in the vault, so that the eye looked down from it as into a well. The cell was large, and if it was the bottom of a well, it must have been a cyclopean one. The idea that the old word cul de fosse awakens in the mind can only be applied to it if it were a lair of wild beasts. The cell was neither flagged nor paved. The bottom was of that cold, moist earth peculiar to deep places. In the midst of the cell, 4 low and disproportioned columns sustained a porch heavily ogival, of which the 4 moldings united in the interior of the porch, something like the inside of a meter. This porch, similar to the pinnacles under which sarcophagi were formerly placed, rose nearly to the top of the vault, and made a sort of central chamber in the cavern, if that could be called a chamber which had only pillars in place of walls. From the key of the arch hung a brass lamp, round and barred like the window of a prison. This lamp threw around it, on the pillars, on the vault, on the circular wall which was seen dimly behind the pillars, a wan light, cut by bars of shadow. This was the light which had at first dazzled Gwynplaine. Now it threw out only a confused redness. There was no other light in the cell, neither window, nor door, nor loophole. Between the 4 pillars, exactly below the lamp, in the spot where there was most light, a pale and terrible form lay on the ground. It was lying on its back. A head was visible of which the eyes were shut, a body of which the chest was a shapeless mass, 4 limbs belonging to the body, in the position of the cross of St. Andrew, were drawn towards the 4 pillars by 4 chains fastened to each foot and each hand. These chains were fastened to an iron ring at the base of each column. The form was held immovable in the horrible position of being quartered, and had the icy look of a livid corpse. It was naked. It was a man. Gwynplaine, as if petrified, stood at the top of the stairs, looking down. Suddenly he heard a rattle in the throat. The corpse was alive. Close to the spectre, in one of the ogives of the door, on each side of a great seat, which stood on a large flat stone, stood 2 men swathed in long black cloaks, and on the seat, swathed in black cloaks, and on the seat an old man was sitting, dressed in a red robe, wan, motionless, and ominous, holding a bunch of roses in his hand. The bunch of roses would have enlightened anyone less ignorant than Gwynplaine. The right of judging with a nosegay in his hand implied the holder to be a magistrate, at once royal and municipal. The Lord Mayor of London still keeps up the custom. To assist the deliberations of the judges was the function of the earliest roses of the season. The bunch of roses would have enlightened anyone less ignorant than Gwynplaine. The right of judging with a nosegay in his hand implied the holder to be a magistrate, at once royal and municipal. The Lord Mayor of London still keeps up the custom. To assist the deliberations of the judges was the function of the earliest roses of the season. The old man seated on the bench was the sheriff of the county of Surrey. He was the majestic rigidity of a Roman dignitary. The bench was the only seat in the cell. By the side of it was a table covered with papers and books, on which lay the long white wand of the sheriff. The men standing by the side of the sheriff were 2 doctors, one of medicine, the other of law, the latter recognizable by the sergeant's coif over his wig. Both wore black robes, one of the shape worn by judges, the other by doctors. Men of these kinds wear mourning for the deaths of which they are the cause. Behind the sheriff, at the edge of the flat stone under the seat, was crouched, with a writing table near to him, a bundle of papers on his knees, and a sheet of parchment on the bundle. A secretary, in a round wig, with a pen in his hand, in the attitude of a man ready to write. This secretary was of the class called keeper of the bag, as was shown by a bag at his feet. These bags, in former times employed in law processes, were termed bags of justice. With folded arms leaning against a pillar was a man entirely dressed in leather, the hangman's assistant. These men seemed as if they had been fixed by enchantment in their funereal postures round the chained man. None of them spoke or moved. There brooded over all a fearful calm. When Gwynplaine saw What Gwynplaine saw was a torture chamber. There were many such in England. The crypt of Beauchamp Tower long served this purpose, as did also the cell of the Lollards' prison. A place of this nature is still to be seen in London, called the Vaults of Lady Place. In this last mentioned chamber there is a grate for the purpose of heating the irons. All the prisons of King John's time, and Southwark Jail was one, had their chambers of torture. The scene which is about to follow was in those days a frequent one in England, and might even, by criminal process, be carried out today, since the same laws are still unrepealed. England offers the curious sight of a barbarous code living on the best terms with liberty. We confess that they make an excellent family party. Some distrust, however, might not be undesirable. In the case of a crisis, a return to the penal code would not be impossible. English legislation is a tamed tiger with a velvet paw, but the claws are still there. Cut the claws of the law and you will do well. Law almost ignores right. On one side is penalty, on the other humanity. Philosophers protest, but it will take some time yet before the justice of man is assimilated to the justice of God. Respect for the law, that is the English phrase. In England they venerate so many laws that they never repeal any. They save themselves from the consequence of their veneration by never putting them into execution. An old law falls into disuse like an old woman, and they never think of killing either one or the other. They cease to make use of them, that is all. They cease to make use of them, that is all. Both are at liberty to consider themselves still young and beautiful. They may fancy that they are as they were. This politeness is called respect. Norman custom is very wrinkled. That does not prevent many an English judge casting sheep's eyes at her. They stick amorously to an antiquated atrocity, so long as it is Norman. What can be more savage than the gibbet? In 1867 a man was sentenced to be cut into 4 quarters and offered to a woman, the Queen. There's a footnote right there, and it says the Fenian, Burke. Still, torture was never practiced in England. History asserts this as a fact. The assurance of history is wonderful. Matthew of Westminster mentions that the Saxon law, very clement and kind, did not punish criminals by death, and adds that it limited itself to cutting off the nose and scooping out the eyes. That was all. Gwynplaine, scared and haggard, stood at the top of the steps, trembling in every limb. He shuddered from head to foot. He tried to remember what crime he had committed. To the silence of the wapentake had succeeded the vision of torture to be endured. It was a step, indeed, forward, but a tragic one. He saw the dark enigma of the law under the power of which he felt himself increasing in obscurity. The human form lying on the earth rattled in its throat again. Gwynplaine felt someone touching him gently on his shoulder. It was the wapentake. Gwynplaine knew that meant that he was to descend. He obeyed. He descended the stairs step by step. They were very low, each 8 or 9 inches in height. There was no handrail. The descent required caution. 2 steps behind Gwynplaine followed the wapentake, holding up his iron weapon, and at the same interval behind the wapentake the justice of the quorum. As he descended the steps, Gwynplaine felt an indescribable extinction of hope. There was death in each step. In each one that he descended there died a ray of the light within him. Growing paler and paler, he reached the bottom of the stairs. The larva, lying chained to the 4 pillars, still rattled in his throat. A voice in the shadow said, "Approach." The sheriff addressing Gwynplaine. Gwynplaine took a step forward. "Closer," said the sheriff. The justice of the quorum murmured in the ear of Gwynplaine so gravely that there was solemnity in the whisper. "You are before the sheriff of the county of Surrey." Gwynplaine advanced towards the victim extended in the center of the cell. The wapentake and the justice of the quorum remained where they were, allowing Gwynplaine to advance alone. When Gwynplaine reached the spot under the porch, close to that miserable thing which he had hitherto perceived only from a distance, but which was a living man, his fear rose to terror. The man who was chained there was quite naked, except for that rag so hideously modest, which might be called the wine-leaf of punishment, the succingulum of the Romans, and the Christopanus of the Goths, of which the old Gaelic jargon made cripang. Christ wore but that shred on the cross. The terror-stricken sufferer whom Gwynplaine now saw seemed a man of about 50 or 60 years of age. He was bald. Grizzly hairs of beard bristled on his chin. His eyes were closed, his mouth opened. Every tooth was to be seen. His thin and bony face was like a death's head. His arms and legs were fastened by chains to the 4 stone pillars in the shape of the letter X. He had on his breast and belly a plate of iron, and on this iron 5 or 6 large stones were laid. His rattle was at times a sigh, at times a roar. The sheriff, still holding his bunch of roses, took from the table with the hand which was free his white wand, and standing up said, "Obedience to Her Majesty." Then he replaced the wand upon the table. Then, in words long drawn as a knell, without a gesture, and immovable as the sufferer, the sheriff, raising his voice, said, "Man who liest here, bound in chains, listen for the last time to the voice of justice. You have been taken from your dungeon and brought to this cell, legally summoned in the usual forms, formalis verbis pressis, not regarding to lectures and communications which have been made and which will now be repeated to you. Inspired by a bad and perverse spirit of tenacity, you have preserved silence and refused to answer the judge. This is the detestable license which constitutes, among deeds punishable by a cashlet, the crime and misdemeanor of overseness." Sergeant of the Coif, on the right of the sheriff, interrupted him and said with an indifference indescribably lugubrious to its effect, "Overhernesse, Laws of Alfred and of Godwin, chapter the 6th." The sheriff resumed, "The law is respected by all except by scoundrels who infest the woods where the hinds bear young." Like one clock striking after another, the sergeant said, "Qui faisant victim in foreste ubi demoi solent fernier." "He who refuses to answer the magistrate," said the sheriff, "is suspected of every vice. He is reputed capable of every evil." The sergeant interposed. "Prodigius devator profusus salix, ruffianus ebrusus luxurius simulator, consumptor patrimoni eloi ambro et gluto. Every vice, said the sheriff, means every crime. He who confesses nothing confesses everything. He who holds his peace before the questions of the judge is, in fact, a liar and a parricide. Mendax et parricida, said the sergeant. The sheriff said, Man, it is not permitted to absent oneself by silence. To pretend contumaciousness is a wound given to the law. It is like Diomede wounding a goddess. Taciturnity before a judge is a form of rebellion. Treason to justice is a high treason. Nothing is more hateful or rash. He who resists interrogation steals truth. The law has provided for this. For such cases, the English have always enjoyed the right of the fosse, the fork, and chains. Anglica Charter, year 1088, said the sergeant. Then, with the same mechanical gravity, he added, Ferrum et fossum et furcus cum aliis libertatibus. The sheriff continued, Man, forasmuch as you have not chosen to break silence, though of sound mind and having full knowledge in respect of the subject concerning which justice demands an answer, and forasmuch as you are diabolically refractory, you have necessarily been put to torture, and you have been, by the terms of the criminal statutes, tried by the pene forte et dure. This is what has been done to you, for the law requires that I should fully inform you. You have been brought to this dungeon. You have been stripped of your clothes. You have been laid on your back naked on the ground. Your limbs have been stretched and tied to the 4 pillars of the law. A sheet of iron has been placed on your chest, and as many stones as you can bear have been heaped on your belly. And more, says the law. Plusque, affirmed the sergeant. The sheriff continued. In this situation, and before prolonging the torture, a second summons to answer and to speak has been made you by me, sheriff of the county of Surrey, and you have satanically kept silent, though under torture, chains, shackles, fetters, and irons. Attachamente legalia, said the sergeant. On your refusal and contumacy, said the sheriff. It being right that the obstinacy of the law should equal the obstinacy of the criminal, the proof has been continued according to the edicts and texts. The first day you were given nothing to eat or drink. Hoc est super genera, said the sergeant. There was silence. The awful hiss of the man's breathing was heard from under the heap of stones. The sergeant at law completed his quotation. Ade augmentum abstinense ciborum diminuento consuetudo Britannica Article 504. The 2 men, the sheriff and sergeant, alternated. Nothing could be more dreary than their imperturbable monotony. The mournful voice responded to the ominous voice. It might be said that the priest and the deacon of punishment were celebrating the savage mass of the law. The sheriff resumed. On the first day you were given nothing to eat or drink. On the second day you were given food, but nothing to drink. Between your teeth were thrust 3 mouthfuls of barley bread. On the third day they gave you to drink, but nothing to eat. They poured into your mouth at 3 different times, and in 3 different glasses, a pint of water taken from the common sewer of the prison. The 4th day is come. It is today. Now, if you do not answer, you will be here till you die. Justice wills it. The sergeant, ready with his reply, appeared. Moris re homogeum est buncle legi. And while you feel yourself dying miserably, resumed the sheriff, no one will attend to you, even when the blood rushes from your throat, your chin, and your armpits, and every pore, from the mouth to the loins. Athrotabola, said the sergeant, et pabu et sub hirsis et agrumno usque ad craponum. The sheriff continued. Man, attend to me, because the consequences concern you. If you renounce your execrable silence, and if you confess, you will only be hanged, and you will have a right to the meldefeo, which is a sum of money. Damnum confetens, said the sergeant, habeat le meldefeo legis in se, chapter the 20th. Which sum, insisted the sheriff, shall be paid in doitkins, suskins, and galahalpins, the only case in which this money is to pass, according to the terms of the statute of abolition in the 3rd of Henry V. And you will have the right and enjoyment of scortum ante mortem, and then be hanged on the gibbet, which are the advantages of confession. Does it place you to answer to justice? The sheriff ceased and waited. The prisoner lay motionless. The sheriff resumed. Man, silence is a refuge in which there is more risk than safety. The obstinate man is damnable and vicious. He who is silent before justice is a felon to the crown. Do not persist in this unfilial disobedience. Think of her majesty. Do not oppose our gracious queen. When I speak to you, answer her. Be a loyal subject. The patient rattled in the throat. The sheriff continued. So after the 72 hours of the proof, here we are at the 4th day. Man, this is the decisive day. The 4th day has been fixed by the law for the confrontation. Quarta di frontum ad frontem adus, growled the sergeant. The wisdom of law, continued the sheriff, has chosen his last hour to hold what our ancestors called judgment by mortal cold, seeing that it is the moment when men are believed on their yes or their no. The sergeant on the right confirmed his words. Judicium pro fraud mortel quod homines credenti sint per sum ja et per sum no. Charter of King Aldiston, volume the 1st, page 163. There was a moment's pause. Then the sheriff bent his stern face towards the prisoner. Man who art lying there on the ground. He paused. Man, he cried, do you hear me? The man did not move. In the name of the law, said the sheriff, open your eyes. The man's lids remained closed. The sheriff turned to the doctor, who was standing on his left. Doctor, give your diagnostic. Probe la diagnosticum, said the sergeant. The doctor came down with magisterial stiffness, approached the man, leant over him, put his ear close to the mouth of the sufferer, felt the pulse at the wrist, the armpit, and the thigh, then rose again. Well, said the sheriff. He can still hear, said the doctor. Can he see? Inquired the sheriff. The doctor answered. He can see. On a sign from the sheriff, the justice of the quorum and the wapentake advanced. The wapentake placed himself near the head of the patient. The justice of the quorum stood behind Gwynplaine. The doctor retired a step behind the pillars. Then the sheriff, raising the bunch of roses as a priest about to sprinkle holy water, called to the prisoner in a loud voice and became awful. "O wretched man, speak! The law supplicates before she exterminates you. You, who feign to be mute, remember how mute is the tomb. You, who appear deaf, remember that damnation is more death. Think of the death which is worse than your present state. Repent. You are about to be left alone in this cell. Listen, you who are my likeness, for I am a man. Listen, my brother, because I am a Christian. Listen, my son, because I am an old man. Look at me, for I am the master of your sufferings, and I am about to become terrible. The terrors of the law make up the majesty of the judge. Believe that I myself tremble before myself. My own power alarms me. Do not drive me to extremities. I am filled by the holy malice of chastisement. Feel, then, wretched man, the salutary and honest fear of justice, and obey me. The hour of confrontation is come, and you must answer. Do not harden yourself in resistance. Do not that which will be irrevocable. Think that your end belongs to me, half man, half corpse. Listen. At least, let it not be your determination to expire here, exhausted for hours, days, and weeks, by frightful agonies of hunger and foulness, under the weight of those stones, alone in this cell, deserted, forgotten, annihilated, left as food for the rats and the weasels, gnawed by creatures of darkness while the world comes and goes, buys and sells, whilst carriages roll in the streets above your head, unless you would continue to draw painful breath without remission in the depths of this despair, grinding your teeth, weeping, blaspheming, without a doctor to appease the anguish of your wounds, without a priest to offer a divine draught of water to your soul. Oh, if only that you may not feel the frightful froth of the sepulchre ooze slowly from your lips. I adjure and conjure you to hear me. I call you to your own aid. Have pity on yourself. Do what is asked of you. Give way to justice. Open your eyes and see if you recognize this man. The prisoner neither turned his head nor lifted his eyelids. The sheriff cast a glance first at the justice of the quorum and then at the wapentake. The justice of the quorum, taking Gwynplaine's hat and mantle, put his hands on his shoulders and placed him in the light by the side of the chained man. The face of Gwynplaine stood out clearly from the surrounding shadow in its strange relief. At the same time, the wapentake bent down, took the man's temples between his hands, turned the inert head towards Gwynplaine, and with his thumbs and his first fingers lifted the closed eyelids. The prisoner saw Gwynplaine. Then, raising his head voluntarily and opening his eyes wide, he looked at him. He quivered as much as a man can quiver with a mountain on his breast, and then cried out, "'Tis he! Yes, 'tis he!" And he burst into a horrible laugh. "'Tis he!" he repeated. Then his head fell back on the ground, and he closed his eyes again. "Registrar, take that down," said the justice. Gwynplaine, though terrified, had up to that moment preserved a calm exterior. The cry of the prisoner, "'Tis he!" overwhelmed him completely. The words, "Registrar, take that down," froze him. It seemed to him that a scoundrel had dragged him to his fate without his being able to guess why, and that the man's unintelligible confession was closing round him like the clasp of an iron collar. He fancied himself side by side with him in the posts of the same pillory. Gwynplaine lost his footing in his terror, and protested. He began to stammer incoherently, words in the deep distress of an innocent man, and quivering, terrified, lost, uttered the first random outcries that rose to his mind, and words of agony like aimless projectiles. It is not true. It is not me. I do not know the man. He cannot know me, since I do not know him. I have my part to play this evening. What do you want of me? I demand my liberty. Nor is that all. Why have I been brought into this dungeon? Are there no laws? Are there laws no longer? You may as well say at once that there are no laws. My lord judge, I repeat that it is not I. I am innocent of all that can be said. I know I am. I wish to go away. This is not justice. There is nothing between this man and me. You can find out. My life is not hidden up. They came and took me away like a thief. Why did they come like that? How could I know the man? I am a traveling performer who plays farces at fairs and markets. I am the laughing man. Plenty of people have been to see me. We are staying in Tarrinzeau Field. I have been earning an honest livelihood these 15 years. I am 25. I lodge at the Tadcaster Inn. I am called Gwynplaine. My lord, let me out. You should not take advantage of the low estate of the unfortunate. Have compassion on a man who has done no harm, who is without protection and without defense. You have before you a poor performer. I have before me, said the sheriff, Lord Fermain Clancharlie, Baron Clancharlie and Hunkerville, Marquis of Carleone in Sicily, and a peer of England. Rising and offering his chair to Gwynplaine, the sheriff added, My lord, will your lordship deign to seat yourself? Okay, not only is that the end of the chapter, that is the end of the fourth book. Okay, so wild. Wild. And something that we sort of thought might be happening. Okay, let's go back. So, this chapter starts with Gwynplaine still being among all of the quorum and walking through the passage, and he's seeing that the passage it's all dark. You can't really see anything, but he's noticing that they are descending by very small degrees, but descending into what is basically a torture chamber, but there are no torture chambers in London or England or any of these places about that. Officially, there aren't any, but there's definitely one here. And so he walks in and he sees somebody he sees two people in black robes, and he sees somebody who, like, a man who is naked, and he's noticing that the man who is naked has this like huge iron plate on him, and on top of the iron plate is a bunch of rocks. And he's listening to the sheriff and this sergeant talking to the man, and the man has been there. This is the fourth day that the man has been there and being tortured, unofficially, because officially there's no torture chambers. And the sergeant or the sheriff is just going through and saying, like, all right, on the first day we didn't give you any food or water. On the second day we didn't give you any water. We gave you bread 3 times. On the third day, like, just going through all of these things, and he's like, answer me, and this is what will happen. If you don't answer me, this is what will happen. And the guy's unresponsive because obviously he's been tortured for 4 days. And so the sheriff is like, doctor, can you like check on him real quick? And so the doctor comes over and he's like, yeah, he can hear you. Yes, he can talk. Yes, he can open his eyes. Like, all of these functions are there. And so the sheriff is just going back and forth. The magistrate, or the, I keep calling the magistrate. The sergeant is basically just like repeating what the sheriff is saying, or like citing what the sheriff is saying. So they have like a little back and forth. And towards the end, the man who's being tortured like opens his eyes and he sees Gwynplaine. They move Gwynplaine into the light. He sees Gwynplaine and he's like, it's him. That's him. That's him. And he keeps repeating that. And then he like drops back down onto the ground, and Gwynplaine like just goes off. Goes against Ursus's warning saying don't talk at all unless you are explicitly asked a question, which is goes off and says like, I'm innocent, I haven't done anything, I don't know who this person is, I've just been traveling around and performing for the last 15 years, I'm 25 years old, like I haven't done anything. And the sheriff is like, dude, you're a royal, you are part of the Clan Charlie line, have a seat, my lord. Which is a shock. But at the same time, we had the idea, so long time ago in the reading, or so it seems like a long time ago, when they were talking about the royal lines. With the Clan Charlie line, he self excommunicated himself, self fled. And there were rumors that he had an heir. And so the king was like, well, I don't want this heir to rule. I want somebody who's going to rule, who will be able to be swayed by anything and everything that I want. And so the idea that we sort of talked about before was that the king probably had the heir mutilated so that nobody would know who it was. And that mutilated heir is Gwynplaine. And lo and behold, here we are. I mean, we don't know that the king ordered this to be done or anything like that. But also, there's officially no torture chambers. So, I think it falls into that same category. So now, we're closing the chapter on that book, and we're entering book the fifth, which is called The Sea and Fate Are Moved by the Same Breath, which, beautiful. That's beautiful. Here we go. Chapter 1. The Durability of Fragile Things. Destiny sometimes proffers us a glass of madness to drink. A hand is thrust out of the mist and suddenly hands us the mysterious cup in which is contained the latent intoxication. Gwynplaine did not understand. He looked behind him to see who it was who had been addressed. A sound may be too sharp to be perceptible to the ear. An emotion too acute conveys no meaning to the mind. There is a limit to comprehension as well as to hearing. The wapentake and the justice of the quorum approached Gwynplaine and took him by the arms. He felt himself placed in the chair which the sheriff had just vacated. He let it be done, without seeking an explanation. When Gwynplaine was seated, the justice of the quorum and the wapentake retired a few steps, and stood upright and motionless behind the seat. Then the sheriff placed his bunch of roses on the stone table, put on spectacles which the secretary gave him, drew from the bundles of paper which covered the table a sheet of parchment. Yellow, green, torn and jagged in places, which seemed to have been folded in very small folds, and of which one side was covered with writing. Standing under the light of the lamp, he held the sheet close to his eyes, and in most solemn tone read as follows: In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, this present day, the 29th of January, 1619th year of our Lord, has been wickedly deserted on the desert coast of Portland, with the intention of allowing him to perish of hunger, of cold, and of solitude, a child 10 years old. The child was sold at the age of 2 years, by order of his most gracious Majesty, King James II. The child is Lord Fermain Clancharlie, the only legitimate son of Lord Linnaeus Clancharlie, Baron Clancharlie, and Hunkerville, Marquis of Corleone in Sicily, a peer of England, and of Anne Bradshaw, his wife, both deceased. That child is the inheritor of the estates and titles of his father. For this reason he was sold, mutilated, disfigured, and put out of the way by desire of his most gracious majesty. That child was brought up and trained to be a mountebank at markets and fairs. He was sold at the age of 2 after the death of the peer, his father, and 10 pounds sterling were given to the king as his purchase money, as well as for divers concessions, tolerations, and immunities. Lord Fermain Clancharlie, at the age of 2 years, was bought by me, the undersigned, who write these lines, and mutilated and disfigured by a Fleming of Flanders called Hardquanonne, who alone is acquainted with the secrets and modes of treatment of Dr. Conquest. The child was destined by us to be a laughing masca ridens. With this intention, Hardquanonne performed on him the operation bucofisa usque ad auris, which stamps an everlasting laugh upon his face. The child, by means known only to Hardquanonne, was put to sleep and made insensible during its performance, knowing nothing of the operation which he underwent. He does not know that he is Lord Clancharlie. He answers to the name Gwynplaine. This fact is the result of his youth and the slight powers of memory he could have had when he was bought and sold, being then barely 2 years old. Hardquanonne is the only person who knows how to perform the operation bucofisa, and the said child is the only living subject upon which it has been essayed. The operation is so unique and singular that though after long years this child should have come to an old man instead of a child, and his black locks should have turned white, he would be immediately recognized by Hardquanonne. At the time that I am writing this, Hardquanonne, who has perfect knowledge of all facts and participated as principal therein, is detained in the prisons of His Highness the Prince of Orange, commonly called King William III. Hardquanonne was apprehended and seized as being one of the band of Comprachicos or Chelas. He is imprisoned in the dungeon of Chatham. It was in Switzerland, near the Lake of Geneva, between Lausanne and Lévis, in the very house in which his father and mother died, that the child was, in obedience with the orders of the king, sold and given up by the last servant of the deceased Lord Linnaeus, which servant died soon after his master, so that his secret and delicate matter is now unknown to anyone on earth, excepting Hardquanonne, who is in the dungeon of Chatham, and ourselves, now about to perish. We, the undersigned, brought up and kept for 8 years, for professional purposes, the little lord bought by us, by the king. Today, flying from England to avoid Hardquanonne's ill fortune, our fear of the penal indictments, prohibitions, and fulminations of Parliament has induced us to desert at nightfall on the coast of Portland the said child Gwynplaine, who is Lord Fermain Clancharlie. Now we have sworn secrecy to the king, but not to God. To-night at sea, overtaken by a violent tempest, by the will of Providence, full of despair and distress, kneeling before him who could save our lives, and may, perhaps, be willing to save our souls, having nothing more to hope from men, but everything to fear from God, having for only anchor and resource repentance of our bad actions, designed to death, and content, if divine justice be satisfied, humble, penitent, and beating our breasts, we make this declaration and confide and deliver it to the furious ocean to use as it best may according to the will of God. And may the Holy Virgin aid us. Amen. and we attach our signatures." The sheriff interrupted, saying, "Here are the signatures, all in different handwritings." And he resumed. "Dr. Gernardus Gistemund Asuncion. Across and at the side of it, Barbara Fermoy from Tirifile and the Hebrides. Gaisdora, Captain. Guyengaret. Jacques Cortoz, alias Le Barnet. Luc Perrier, Capgaro, from the galleys of Mahone." The sheriff, after a pause, resumed. "A note written in the same hand as the text of the first signature," and he read, "Of the 3 men comprising the crew, the skipper having been swept off by a wave, there remain but 2, and we have signed Galdazin, Ave Maria, thief." The sheriff, interspersing his reading with his own observations, continued, "At the bottom of the sheet is written, 'At sea, on board of the Matutina, Biscay hooker, from the Gulf de Passages.' This sheet," added the sheriff, "is a legal document bearing the mark of King James II. On the margin of the declaration, and in the same handwriting, there is a note. The present declaration is written by us on the back of the royal order, which was given us as our receipt when we bought the child. Turn the leaf, and the order will be seen." The sheriff turned the parchment and raised it in his right hand to expose it to the light. A blank page was seen, if the word blank can be applied to a thing so moldy, and in the middle of the page 3 words were written, 2 Latin words, Jussu Regis, and a signature, Jeffreys. "Jussu Regis Jeffreys," said the sheriff, passing from a grave voice to a clear one. Gwynplaine was as a man on whose head a tile falls from the palace of dreams. He began to speak, like one who speaks unconsciously. "Gernardus, yes, the doctor, an old, sad-looking man. I was afraid of him. Gaisdora, captain, that means chief. There were women, Asuncion and the other, and then the provincial. His name was Capgarope. He used to drink out of a flat bottle on which there was a name written in red." "Behold it," said the sheriff. He placed on the table something which the secretary had just taken out of the bag. It was a gourd, with handles like ears, covered with wicker. This bottle had evidently seen service, and had sojourned in the water. Shells and seaweed adhered to it. It was encrusted and damascened over with the rust of ocean. There was a ring of tar round its neck, showing that it had been hermetically sealed. Now it was unsealed and open. They had, however, replaced in the flask a sort of bung made of tarred oakum, which had been used to cork it. "It was in this bottle," said the sheriff, "that the men about to perish placed the declaration which I have just read. This message, addressed to justice, has been faithfully delivered by the sea." The sheriff increased the majesty of his tones, and continued, "In the same way that Harrow Hill produces excellent wheat, which is turned into fine flour for the royal table, so the sea renders every service in its power to England, and when a nobleman is lost, finds and restores him." Then he resumed, "On this flask, as you say, there is a name written in red." He raised his voice, turning to the motionless prisoner. "Your name, malefactor, is here. Such are the hidden channels by which truth, swallowed up in the gulf of human actions, floats to the surface." The sheriff took the gourd and turned to the light one of its sides, which had, no doubt, been cleaned for the ends of justice. Between the interstices of wicker was a narrow line of red reed, blackened here and there by the action of water and of time. The reed, notwithstanding some breakages, traced distinctly in the wickerwork these 12 letters: Hardquanonne. The sheriff, resuming that monotonous tone of voice which resembles nothing else, and which may be termed a judicial accent, turned towards the sufferer. Hardquanonne, when by us, the sheriff, this bottle on which is your name, was the first time shown, exhibited, and presented to you, you at once, and willingly recognized it as having belonged to you. Then, the parchment being read to you which was contained, folded and enclosed within it, you would say no more, and in the hope, doubtless, that the lost child would never be recovered, and that you would escape punishment, you refuse to answer. As a result of your refusal, you have had applied to you the penaforte et dure, and the second reading of the said parchment, on which is written the declaration and confession of your accomplices, was made to you, but in vain. This is the 4th day, and that which is legally set apart for the confrontation, that he who was deserted on the 29th of January, 1690, having been brought into your presence, your devilish hope has vanished. You have broken silence, and recognized your victim. The prisoner opened his eyes, lifted his head, and, with a voice strangely resonant of agony, but which had still an indescribable calm mingled with its hoarseness, pronounced in excruciating accents, from under the mass of stones, words to pronounce each of which he had to lift that which was the slab of a tomb placed upon him. He spoke. I swore to keep the secret. I have kept it as long as I could. Men of dark lives are faithful, and hell has its honor. Now silence is useless. So be it. For this reason I speak. Well, yes, 'tis he. We did it between us, the king and I. The king by his will, I by my art. And looking at Gwynplaine, now laugh forever. And he himself began to laugh. This second laugh, wilder yet than the first, might have been taken for a sob. The laugh ceased, and the man lay back, his eyelids closed. The sheriff, who had allowed the prisoner to speak, resumed, "All which is placed on record." He gave the secretary time to write, and then said, Hardquanonne, by the terms of the law, after confrontation followed by identification, after the third reading of the declarations of your accomplices, since confirmed by your recognition and confession, and after your renewed avowal, you are about to be relieved from these irons, and placed at the good pleasure of Her Majesty to be hung as plagiary. Plagiary, said the sergeant of the coif. That is to say, a buyer and seller of children. Law of the Visigoths, 7th book, 3rd. Qui peros vendis plagiarius est tibi nomen. The sheriff placed the parchment on the table, laid down his spectacles, took up the nosegay, and said, End of la piene forte et dure. Harlequin, thank your majesty. By a sign, the justice of the quorum set in motion the man dressed in leather. This man, who was the executioner's assistant, groom of the gibbet, the old charters call him, went to the prisoner, took off the stones one by one from his chest, and lifted the plane of iron up, exposing the wretch's crushed sides. Then he freed his wrists and ankle bones from the 4 chains that fastened him to the pillars. The prisoner, released alike from stones and chains, lay flat on the ground, his eyes closed, his arms and legs apart, like a crucified man taken down from a cross. Hardquanonne, said the sheriff, arise. The prisoner did not move. The groom of the gibbet took up a hand and let it go. The hand fell back. The other hand, being raised, fell back likewise. The groom of the gibbet seized one foot and then the other, and the heels fell back on the ground. The fingers remained inert, and the toes motionless. The naked feet of an extended corpse seemed, as it were, to bristle. The doctor approached, and drawing from the pocket of his robe a little mirror of steel, put it in the open mouth of Hardquanonne. Then with his fingers he opened the eyelids. They did not close again. The glassy eyeballs remained fixed. The doctor rose up and said, "He is dead." And he added, "He laughed. That killed him." "'Tis of little consequence," said the sheriff. "After confession, life or death is a mere formality." Then, pointing to Hardquanonne by a gesture with the nosegay of roses, the sheriff gave the order to the wapentake. "A corpse to be carried away tonight." The wapentake acquiesced by a nod, and the sheriff added, "The cemetery of the jail is opposite." The wapentake nodded again. The sheriff, holding in his left hand the nosegay and in his right the white wand, placed himself opposite Gwynplaine, who was still seated, and made him a low bow. Then, assuming another solemn attitude, he turned his head over his shoulder, and looking at Gwynplaine in the face, said, "To you here present, we, Philip Denzil Parsons, Knight, Sheriff of the County of Surrey, assisted by Aubrey Dominic Esquire, our clerk and registrar, and by our usual officers duly provided by the direct and special commands of Her Majesty, in virtue of our commission and the rights and duties of our charge, and with authority from the Lord Chancellor of England, the affidavits having been drawn up and recorded, regard being had to the documents communicated by the Admiralty, after verification of attestations and signatures, after declarations read and heard, after confrontation made, all the statements and legal information having been completed, exhausted, and brought to a good and just issue, we signify and declare to you, in order that right may be done, that you are Fermain Clancharlie, Baron Clancharlie and Hunkerville, Marquis de Corleone, in Sicily, and a peer of England, and God keep your kinship, your lordship." And he bowed to him. The sergeant on the right, the doctor, the justice of the quorum, the wapentake, the secretary, all the attendants except the executioner, repeated his salutation, still more respectfully, and bowed to the ground before Gwynplaine. "Ah," said Gwynplaine, "awaken me." And he stood up, pale as death. "I come to awaken you, indeed," said a voice which had not yet been heard. A man came out from behind the pillars. As no one had entered the cell since the sheet of iron had given passage to the cortege of police, it was clear that this man had been there in the shadow before Gwynplaine had entered, that he had a regular right of attendance, and had been present by appointment and mission. The man was fat and pursy, and wore a court wig and a travelling cloak. He was rather old than young, and very precise. He saluted Gwynplaine with ease and respect, with the ease of a gentleman in waiting, and without the awkwardness of a judge. "Yes," he said, "I have come to awaken you. For 25 years you have slept. You have been dreaming. It is time to awaken. You believe yourself to be Gwynplaine. You are Clancharlie. You believe yourself to be one of the people. You belong to the peerage. You believe yourself to be of the lowest rank. You are of the highest. You believe yourself a player. You are a senator. You believe yourself poor. You are wealthy. You believe yourself to be of no account. You are important. Awake, my lord." Gwynplaine, in a low voice, in which a tremor of fear was to be distinguished, murmured, "What does it all mean?" "It means, my lord," said the fat man, that I am called Barkilphedro, that I am the officer of the Admiralty, that this waif, the flask of Hardquanonne, was found on the beach and was brought to be unsealed by me, according to the duty and prerogative of my office, that I opened it in the presence of 2 sworn jurors of the Jetsam office, both members of Parliament, William Brathwaite of the city of Bath, and Thomas Jervaux of Southampton, that the 2 jurors deciphered and attested the contents of the flask, and signed the necessary affidavit conjointly with me, that I made my report to Her Majesty, and by order of the Queen all necessary and legal formalities were carried out with the discretion necessary in a matter so delicate, that the last form, the confrontation, has been carried out, that you have £40,000 a year, that you are a peer of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, a legislator and a judge, a supreme judge, a sovereign legislator, dressed in purple and ermine, equal to princes, like unto emperors, that you have on your brow the coronet of a peer, and that you are about to wed a duchess, the daughter of a king. Under this transfiguration, overwhelming him like a series of thunderbolts, Gwynplaine fainted. And that's the end of chapter 1. Okay, so chapter 1, a lot happens. So we read what our comprachicos wrote in the bottle before they died. That we are tying together everything that we thought might not be important, or everything we thought was only important in this one scene. We're tying everything together, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful. Okay, so we read the note that the people on the ship at the very, very start of this book have written when they're sinking and they're dying. So we read all of that, and it's like, hey, you are Gwynplaine, blah, blah, blah. This is you. And the person who's being tortured is the doctor, Harquanon, who did the work of the smiling face, the scars, all of that nastiness. And he's like, yeah, it's you. And so and he's like, I can confess it now because I'm confessing to God. And then he like laughs and then dies, which is it's wild. So Gwynplaine now is a lord and will be marrying another like aristocracy person. And they're like, yeah, you used to be low, but guess what? You're not anymore. You are of the nobles, you're of the peerage, you're no longer poor like you always thought that you were. Let's awaken you. And the person who awakens them was Barkilphedro, who's been hiding in the shadows this whole time, just like emerges like the diva that he is, and is like, I am the one to awaken you. So we were introduced to him a long time ago. He was hired by the 3 people. So he was hired by Hosiana to look after Lord David. Lord David hired him to look after Hosiana, and then the Queen Anne, hired him to look after both of them. And so he wanted an appointment to being on the flotsam office, and that means that anything that washes up from the sea, he looks at first and then delivers it to the royals, basically. And so he found the bottle that that the people who died on the ship threw into the sea, and that is sort of what started everything. And now the real Dark Souls begins. That's what it seems like. Like, okay, we've had all of this, like, wild. All right. Chapter 2. We'll do one more chapter tonight. Chapter 2. The waif knows its own course. All this had occurred owing to the circumstance of a soldier having found a bottle on the beach. We will relate the facts. In all facts there are wheels within wheels. One day, one of the 4 gunners composing the garrison of Castle Calshor picked up on the sand at low water a flask covered with wicker which had been cast up by the tide. This flask, covered with mold, was corked by a tarred bung. The soldier carried the waif to the colonel of the castle, and the colonel sent it to the High Admiral of England. The admiral meant the Admiralty, with waifs. The Admiralty meant Barkilphedro. Barkilphedro, having uncorked and emptied the bottle, carried it to the Queen. The Queen immediately took the matter into consideration. 2 weighty councillors were instructed and consulted, namely, the Lord Chancellor, who is by law the guardian of the King's conscience, and the Lord Marshal, who is referee in heraldry and in the pedigrees of the nobility. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, a Catholic peer, who is hereditary Earl Marshal of England, had sent word by his deputy, Earl Marshal Henry Howard, Earl Bindon, that he would agree with the Lord Chancellor. The Lord Chancellor was William Cowper. We must not confound this Chancellor with his namesake and contemporary William Cowper, the anatomist and commentator on Bidloo, who published a treatise on muscles in England at the very time that Etnie Abiel published a history of bones in France. A surgeon is a very different thing from a lord. Lord William Cowper is celebrated for having, with reference to the affair of Talbot Yelverton, Viscount Longview, propounded this opinion, that in the English Constitution the restoration of a peer is more important than the restoration of a king. The flask found at Calshor had awakened his interest in the highest degree. The author of a maxim delights in opportunities to which it may be applied. Here was a case of the restoration of a peer. Search was made. Gwynplaine, by the inscription over his door, was soon found. Neither was Hardquanonne dead. A prison rots a man, but preserves him, if to keep is to preserve. People placed in bastilles were rarely removed. There is little more change in the dungeon than in the tomb. Hardquanonne was still in prison at Chatham. They had only to put their hands on him. He was transferred from Chatham to London. In the meantime, information was sought in Switzerland. The facts were found to be correct. They obtained from the local archives at Vevey, at Lausanne, the certificate of Lord Linnaeus's marriage in exile, the certificate of his child's birth, the certificate of the decease of the father and mother, and they had duplicates, duly authenticated, made to answer all necessary requirements. All this was done with the most rigid secrecy, with what is called royal promptitude, and with that mole-like silence recommended and practiced by Bacon, and later on made law by Blackstone, for affairs connected with the chancellorship and the state, and in matters termed parliamentary. The Jussu Regis and the signatures Jeffreys were authenticated. To those who have studied pathologically the case of caprice called our good will and pleasure, this Jussu Regis is very simple. Why should James II, whose credit required the concealment of such acts, have allowed that to be written which endangered their success? The answer is cynicism, haughty indifference. Oh, you believe that effrontery is confined to abandoned women? The raison d'etre is equally abandoned. To commit a crime and emblazon it, there is the sum total of history. The king tattoos himself like the convict. Often, when it would be to a man's greatest advantage to escape from the hands of the police or the records of history, he would seem to regret the escape, so great is the love of notoriety. Look at my arm. Observe the design. I am Lacenaire. See, a temple of love and a burning heart pierced through with an arrow. Juicy Regis. It is I, James II. A man commits a bad action and places his mark upon it. To fill up the measure of crime by effrontery, to denounce himself, to cling to his misdeeds, is the insolent bravado of the criminal. Christina seized Monaldeschi and had confessed and assassinated, and said, I am the Queen of Sweden, in the palace of the King of France. There is the tyrant who conceals himself, like Tiberius, and the tyrant who displays himself, like Philip II. One has the attributes of the scorpion, the other, those rather of the leopard. James II was of this latter variety. He had, we know, an open countenance, differing so far from Philip. Philip was sullen, James jovial. Both were equally ferocious. James II was an easy-minded tiger. Like Philip II, his crimes lay light upon his conscience. He was a monster by the grace of God. Therefore, he had nothing to dissimulate nor to extenuate, and his assassinations were by divine right. He, too, would not have minded leaving behind him those archives of Simancas, with all his misdeeds dated, classified, labeled, and put in order, each in its compartment, like poisons in the cabinet of a chemist. To set the sign manual to crimes is right royal. Every deed done is a draft drawn on the great invisible paymaster. A bill had just come due with the ominous endorsement, Jussu Regis. Queen Anne, in one particular unfeminine, seeing that she could keep a secret, demanded a confidential report of so grave a matter from the Lord Chancellor, one of the kind specified as report to the royal ear. Reports of this kind have been common in all monarchies. At Vienna there was a counselor of the ear, an Orlick dignitary. It was an ancient Carlovian office, the auricularis of the old Palatine deeds, he who whispers to the emperor. William, Baron Cowper, Chancellor of England, whom the Queen believed in because he was short-sighted like herself, or even more so, had committed to writing a memorandum commencing thus: two birds were subject to Solomon, a lapwing, a hudbud, who could speak all languages, and an eagle, the Simorganka, who covered with the shadow of his wings a caravan of 20,000 men. Thus, under another form, Providence, etc., the Lord Chancellor proved the fact that the heir to a peerage had been carried off, mutilated, and then restored. He did not blame James II, who was, after all, the Queen's father. He even went so far as to justify him. First, there are ancient monarchical maxims. Secondly, there is a royal right of mutilation. Chamberlain asserts this fact. There's a footnote right there, and it says, the life and the limbs of subjects depend on the king. Chamberlain, Part 2, Chapter 4, page 76. Corpora et bona nostrorum subjectorum nostra sunt, said James I, of glorious and learned memory. The eyes of dukes of the blood royal have been plucked out for the good of the kingdom. Certain princes, too near to the throne, have been conveniently stifled between mattresses, the cause of death being given out as apoplexy. Now to stifle is worse than to mutilate. The king of Tunis tore out the eyes of his father. Muli Assem and his ambassadors have not been the less favorably received by the emperor. Hence, the king may order the suppression of a limb like the suppression of a state, etc. It is legal. But one law does not destroy another. If a drowned man is cast up by the water, and he is not dead, It is an act of God readjusting one of the king. If the heir be found, let the coronet be given back to him. Thus was it done for Lord Allah, King of Northumberland, who was also a mountebank. Thus should be done to Gwynplaine, who is also a king, seeing that he is a peer. The lowness of the occupation which he has been obliged to follow, under constraint of superior power, does not tarnish the blazon, as in the case of Abdolmamin, who was a king, although he had been a gardener; that of Joseph, who was a saint, although he had been a carpenter; that of Apollo, who was a god, although he had been a shepherd. In short, the learned chancellor concluded by advising the reinstatement, in all his estates and dignities, of Lord Fermain Clancharlie, miscalled Gwynplaine, on the sole condition that he should be confronted with the criminal Hardquanonne and identified by the same. And on this point the chancellor, as constitutional keeper of the royal conscience, based the royal decision. The Lord Chancellor added in a postscript that if Hardquanonne refused to answer he should be subjected to the peine-forte et dure until the period called the fraude mortelle, according to the statute of King Athelstane, which orders the confrontation to take place on the 4th day. In this there is a certain inconvenience, for if the prisoner dies on the 2nd or 3rd day, the confrontation becomes difficult. Still, the law must be obeyed. The inconvenience of the law makes part and parcel of it, in the mind of the Lord Chancellor. However, the recognition of Gwynplaine by Hardquanonne is indubitable. Anne, having been made aware of the deformity of Gwynplaine, and not wishing to wrong her sister, on whom had been bestowed the estates of Clancharlie, graciously decided that the Duchess Josiana should be espoused by the new lord, that is to say, by Gwynplaine. The reinstatement of Lord Fermain Clancharlie was, moreover, a very simple affair, the heir being legitimate and in the direct line. In cases of doubtful descent and of peerages in abeyance claimed by collaterals, the House of Lords must be consulted. This, to go no further back, was done in 1782, in the case of the barony of Sidney, claimed by Elizabeth Parry in 1798, in that of the barony of Beaumont, claimed by Thomas Stapleton in 1803, in that of the barony of Stapleton, in 1803, in that of the barony of Chandos, claimed by the Reverend Timewell Bridges, in 1813, in that of the earldom of Banbury, claimed by General Knollys, etc., etc. But the present is no similar case. Here there is no pretense for litigation. The legitimacy was undoubted, the right clear and certain. There is no point to submit to the House, and the Queen, assisted by the Lord Chancellor, had power to recognize and admit the new peer. Barkilphedro managed everything. The affair, thanks to him, was kept so close, the secret was so hermetically sealed, that neither Josiana nor Lord David caught sight of the fearful abyss which was being dug under them. It was easy to deceive Josiana, entrenched as she was behind a rampart of pride. She was self-isolated. As to Lord David, they sent him to sea, off the coast of Flanders. He was going to lose his peerage, and had no suspicion of it. One circumstance is noteworthy. It happened that at 6 leagues from the anchorage of the naval station commanded by Lord David, a captain called Halyburton broke through the French fleet. The Earl of Pembroke, president of the council, proposed that this Captain Halyburton should be made vice-admiral. Anne struck out Halyburton's name and put Lord David Dirry-Muir's in its place, that he might, when no longer a peer, have the satisfaction of being a vice-admiral. Anne was very pleased. A hideous husband for her sister, and a fine step for Lord David. mischief and kindness combined. Her Majesty was going to enjoy a comedy. Besides, she argued to herself that she was repairing an abuse of power committed by her august father. She was reinstating a member of the peerage. She was acting like a great queen. She was protecting innocence according to the will of God, that providence in its holy and impenetrable ways, etc., etc. It is very sweet to do a just action which is disagreeable to those whom we do not like. To know that the future husband of her sister was deformed sufficed the queen. In what matter Gwynplaine was deformed, and by what kind of ugliness, Barkilphedro had not communicated to the queen, and Anne had not deigned to inquire. She was proudly and royally disdainful. Besides, what could it matter? The House of Lords could not but be grateful. The Lord Chancellor, its oracle, had approved. To restore a peer is to restore the peerage. Royalty on this occasion had shown itself a good and scrupulous guardian of the privileges of the peerage. Whatever might be the face of the new lord, a face cannot be urged in objection to a right. Anne said all this to herself, or something like it, and went straight to her object, an object at once grand, womanlike, and regal, namely, to give herself pleasure. The queen was then at Windsor, a circumstance which placed a certain distance between the intrigues of the court and the public. Only such persons as were absolutely necessary to the plan were in the secret of what was taking place. As to Barkilphedro, he was joyful, a circumstance which gave a lugubrious expression to his face. If there be one thing in the world which can be more hideous than another, 'tis joy. He had had the delight of being the first to taste the contents of Harquinon's flask. He seemed but little surprised, for astonishment is the attribute of a little mind. Besides, was it not all due to him who had waited so long on duty at the gate of chance? Knowing how to wait, he had fairly won his reward. This nil admirari was an expression of face. At heart, we may admit that he was very much astonished. Anyone who could have lifted the mask with which he covered his innermost heart even before God would have discovered this. That at the very time Barkilphedro had begun to feel finally convinced that it would be impossible, even to him, the intimate and most infinitesimal enemy of Hosiana, to find a vulnerable point in her lofty life. Hence an access of savage animosity lurked in his mind. He had reached the paroxysm which is called discouragement. He was all the more furious because despairing. To gnaw one's chain, how tragic and appropriate the expression. A villain gnawing at his own powerlessness. Barkilphedro was perhaps just on the point of renouncing not his desire to do evil to Hosiana, but his hope of doing it, not the rage, but the effort. But how degrading to be thus baffled, to keep hate thenceforth in a case like a dagger in a museum. How bitter the humiliation. All at once, to a certain goal, chance, immense and universal, loves to bring such coincidences about. The flask of Harquinon came, driven from wave to wave into Barkilphedro's hands. There is in the unknown an indescribable fealty, which seems to be at the beck and call of evil. Barkilphedro, assisted by two chance witnesses, disinterested jurors of the Admiralty, uncorked the flask, found the parchment, unfolded, read it. What words could express his devilish delight? It is strange to think that the sea, the wind, space, the ebb and flow of the tide, storms, calms, breezes, should have given themselves so much trouble bestow happiness on a scoundrel. That cooperation had continued for 15 years. Mysterious efforts. During 15 years, the ocean had never for an instant ceased from its labors. The waves transmitted from one to another the floating bottle. The shelving rocks had shunned the brittle glass. No crack had yawned in the flask. No friction had displaced the cork. The seaweeds had not rotted the osier. The shell had not eaten out the word Harquanan. The water had not penetrated into the waif. The mold had not rotted the parchment. The wet had not effaced the writing. What trouble the abyss must have taken! Thus, that which Gardanus had flung into darkness, darkness had handed back to Barkilphedro. The message sent to God had reached the devil. Space had committed an abuse of confidence, and a lurking sarcasm which mingles with events had so arranged that it had complicated the loyal triumph of the lost child's becoming Lord Clancharlie with a venomous victory. In doing a good action, it had mischievously placed justice at the service of iniquity. To save the victim of James II was to give a prey to Barkilphedro. To reinstate Gwynplaine was to crush Hosiana. Barkilphedro had succeeded, and it was for this that for so many years the waves, the surge, the squalls had buffeted, shaken, thrown, pushed, tormented, and respected this bubble of glass, which bore within it so many commingled fates. It was for this that there had been a cordial cooperation between the winds, the tides, and the tempests, a vast agitation of all prodigies for the pleasure of a scoundrel, the infinite cooperating with an earthworm. Destiny is subject to such grim caprices. Barkilphedro was struck by a flash of titanic pride. He said to himself that it had all been done to fulfill his intentions. He felt that he was the object and the instrument. But he was wrong. Let us clear the character of chance. Such was not the real meaning of the remarkable circumstance of which the hatred of Barkilphedro was to profit. Ocean had made itself father and mother to an orphan, and sent the hurricane against his executioners, had wrecked the vessel which had repulsed the child, had swallowed up the clasped hands of the storm-beaten sailors, refusing their supplications and accepting only their repentance. The tempest received a deposit from the hands of death. The strong vessel containing the crime was replaced by the fragile vial containing the reparation. The sea changed its character and, like a panther turning nurse, began to rock the cradle, not of the child, but of his destiny, whilst he grew up ignorant of all that the depths of ocean were doing of him. The waves to which this flask had been flung, watching over that past which contained a future, the whirlwind breathing kindly on it, the currents directing the frail waif across the fathomless wastes of water, the caution exercised by seaweed, the swells, the rocks, the vast froth of the abyss, taking under its protection an innocent child. The wave, imperturbable as a conscience, chaos re-establishing order, the world-wide shadows ending in radiance, darkness employed to bring to light the star of truth, the exile consoled in his tomb, the heir given back to his inheritance, the crime of the king repaired, divine premeditation obeyed, the little, the weak, the deserted child with infinity for a guardian, all this Barkilphedro might have seen in the event on which he triumphed. This is what he did not see. He did not believe that it had all been done for Gwynplaine. He fancied that it had been effected for Barkilphedro, and that he was well worth the trouble. Thus it is ever with Satan. Moreover, ere we feel astonished that a waif so fragile should have floated for 15 years undamaged, we should seek to understand the tender care of the ocean. 15 years, is nothing. On the 4th of October 1867, on the coast of Morbihan, between the Isle of Croix, the extremity of the peninsula de Gavris, and the Rocher d'Arens, the fishermen of Port Louis found a Roman amphora on the 4th century, covered with arabesques by the incrustations of the sea. That amphora had been floating 1,500 years. Whatever appearance of indifference Barkilphedro tried to exhibit, his wonder had equaled his joy. Everything he could desire was there in his hands. All seemed ready-made. The fragments of the event which was to satisfy his hate were spread out within his reach. He had nothing to do but to pick them up and fit them together, a repair which it was an amusement to execute. He was the artificer. Gwynplaine. He knew the name. Masca Ridens. Like everyone else, he had been to see the Laughing Man. He had read the sign nailed up against the Tadcaster Inn as one reads a playbill that attracts a crowd. He had noted it. He remembered it directly in its most minute details, and, in any case, it was easy to compare them with the original. That notice, in the electrical summons which arose in his memory, appeared in the depths of his mind, and placed itself by the side of the parchment signed by the shipwrecked crew, like an answer following a question, like the solution following an enigma, and the lines, "Here is to be seen Gwynplaine deserted at the age of 10, on the 29th of January, 1690, on the coast of Portland," suddenly appeared to his eyes in the splendor of an apocalypse. His vision was the light of Main Tekel, a parson, outside a booth. Here was the destruction of the edifice which made the existence of Hosiana. A sudden earthquake. The lost child was found. There was a Lord Clancharlie. David Dirry-Moir was nobody. Peerage, riches, power, rank, all these things left Lord David and entered Gwynplaine. All the castles, parks, forests, townhouses, palaces, domains, Hosiana included, belonged to Gwynplaine. And what a climax for Hosiana. What had she now before her? Illustrious and haughty, a player, beautiful, a monster. Who could have hoped for this? The truth was that the joy of Barkilphedro had become enthusiastic. The most hateful combinations are surpassed by the infernal munificence, there we go, of the unforeseen. When reality likes, it works masterpieces. Barkilphedro found that all his dreams had been nonsense. Reality were better. The change he was about to work would not have seemed less desirable had it been detrimental to him. Insects exist which are so savagely disinterested that they sting, knowing that to sting is to die. Barkilphedro was like such varmin. But this time he had not the merit of being disinterested. Lord David owed him nothing, and Lord Fermain Clancharlie was about to owe him everything. From being a protege, Barkilphedro was about to become a protector. Protector of whom? Of a peer of England. He was going to have a lord of his own, and a lord who would be his creature. Barkilphedro counted on giving him his first impressions. His peer would be the morganatic brother-in-law of the queen. His ugliness would please the queen in the same proportion as it displeased Hosiana. Advancing by such favor, and assuming grave and modest airs, Barkilphedro might become a somebody. He had always been destined for the church. He had a vague longing to be a bishop. Meanwhile, he was happy. Oh, what a great success, and what a deal of useful work had chance accomplished for him. His vengeance, for he called it his vengeance, had been softly brought to him by the waves. He had not lain in ambush in vain. He was the rock. Hosiana was the waif. Hosiana was about to be dashed against Barkilphedro to his intense, villainous ecstasy. He was clever in the art of suggestion, which consists in making in the minds of others a little incision into which you put an idea of your own. Holding himself aloof and without appearing to mix himself up in the matter, it was he who arranged that Hosiana should go to the Green Box and see Gwynplaine. It could do no harm. The appearance of the mountebank in his low estate would be a good ingredient in the combination. Later on, it would season it. He had quietly prepared everything beforehand. What he most desired was something unspeakably abrupt. The work on which he was engaged could only be expressed in these strange words, the construction of a thunderbolt. All preliminaries being complete, he had watched till all the necessary legal formalities had been accomplished. The secret had not oozed out, silence being an element of law. The confrontation of Hardquanonne with Gwynplaine had taken place. Barkilphedro had been present. We have seen the result. The same day a post-chaise belonging to the royal household was suddenly sent by Her Majesty to fetch Lady Hosiana from London to Windsor, where the Queen was at the time residing. Hosiana, for reasons of her own, would have been very glad to disobey, or at least to delay obedience, and put off her departure till next day. But court life does not permit of these objections. She was obliged to set out at once, and to leave her residence in London, Hunkerville House, for her residence at Windsor, Corleone Lodge. The Duchess Hosiana left London at the very moment that the wapentake appeared at the Tadcaster Inn to arrest Gwynplaine and take him to the torture cell of Southwark. When she arrived at Windsor, the usher of the black rod, who guards the door of the presence chamber, informed her that Her Majesty was in audience with the Lord Chancellor, and could not receive her until the next day. That consequently she was to remain at Corleone Lodge at the orders of Her Majesty, and that she should receive the Queen's commands direct, when Her Majesty awoke the next morning. Hosiana entered her house feeling very spiteful, supped in a bad humour, had the spleen, dismissed everyone except her page, then dismissed him, and went to bed while it was yet daylight. When she arrived, she had learned that Lord David was expected at Windsor the next day, owing to his having, whilst at sea, received orders to return immediately and receive Her Majesty's commands. Oh, and that's the end of the chapter. All right, so this chapter, we sort of get the mwahaha moments of Barkilphedro. So Barkilphedro read the letter that was in the bottle and knew that everything was on the up and up for him, because if he passed this along, he knew that Gwynplaine would be reinstated as being a royal. And in doing so, having had a mutilated royal, he knows that Hosiana would not like that, and Hosiana would be the one to marry Gwynplaine. Also, Lord David would move, as recommended by Barkilphedro, to Vice Admiral, which is a lovely post for him. Not a royal post, but still, like, higher up. In doing all of this, Gwynplaine will owe Barkilphedro everything. Everything that will be given to Gwynplaine henceforward is all due to Barkilphedro, and he is counting on that. Queen Anne loves this because now her sister is marrying somebody who is deformed and who has been mutilated and who is not beautiful. And she loves that for her sister because she is so intensely jealous because of him, and not because the stars are lining, the ocean lining, everything like that, to sort of align for Gwynplaine. Yeah. So a lot of things that we were like, well, is this ever gonna come back? It's it has come back. Oh, the web that we have woven. I'm so excited. I'm so excited. I love when you're like, I don't know how this ties in at all. And then you're just like, it's happening. It's happening. And everything is just coming together. It's so, so great. And I'm so excited to see what happens. It'll be a good time. But that's where we're gonna end tonight. On that note, that's where we're gonna end tonight. No, we'll pick up right where we left off, so we'll pick up right at chapter 3. But thank you all for joining me. I'll catch you next time. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you, and I 1000% appreciate your support. Have a good one, everyone. We'll see you very soon.